100 double-barreled boy names: John Paul, David James, Michael Scott, Thomas Edward, William George, Henry Charles, Benjamin Thomas, Samuel Joseph, Daniel William, Robert John, James Michael, Joseph David, Christopher Lee, Alexander William, Matthew Andrew, Richard Thomas, Jonathan Robert, Edward James, Nicholas John, Samuel David, Benjamin Ryan, William Thomas, David Edward, Charles William, Andrew James, Joseph Robert, John David, Thomas Michael, Robert William, Michael David, William Edward, Christopher John, Daniel James, Matthew Joseph, Samuel Thomas, James William, Benjamin Edward, Henry William, Jonathan Scott, Richard James, Alexander John, Edward Joseph, Thomas William, William James, Robert Edward, Joseph Thomas, Michael William, Daniel Joseph, David William, Samuel Richard, John Thomas, Charles Edward, Matthew William, James Edward, Benjamin Michael, Andrew William, Henry James, Christopher James, Nicholas Edward, Samuel William, Robert Thomas, William Michael, David Thomas, Joseph James, Daniel Thomas, Thomas Joseph, Richard William, Alexander Edward, Matthew David, James Robert, Benjamin Joseph, Edward Richard, William Thomas, Samuel Edward, Henry Thomas, Charles James, Robert Michael, Michael Thomas, John Richard, Jonathan Edward, Thomas Andrew, Joseph Edward, David Andrew, James Thomas, Daniel Edward, William Robert, Alexander Thomas, Christopher Scott, Matthew James, Samuel Michael, Benjamin Charles, Richard David, Andrew Thomas, Henry Robert, Edward Michael, Robert James, Jonathan Joseph, William John, Nicholas Thomas, Samuel Jonathan,